Audie Murphy exposed the 9 Golden Age stars who were actually evil. He was America's most decorated World War II combat soldier, a warrior who single-handedly held off 6 German tanks and 250 infantry. A humble farm boy from Texas, Murphy killed or wounded 240 enemy soldiers and earned every medal for valor his country could bestow, including the Medal of Honor. When he came to Hollywood, studios saw a handsome young hero they could mold into a movie star. What they didn't expect was his unflinching moral code and his ability to see through the artificial glamour of Tinseltown to the darkness beneath. Murphy had faced death countless times in Europe, according to a former MGM producer who worked with him in the 1950s. He knew real courage, real evil, and real character. The fake personas of Hollywood couldn't fool him. According to those close to him, Murphy kept a mental list of stars whose public images were complete fabrications. Actors and actresses who presented themselves as heroes, patriots, or moral exemplars while privately engaging in behavior Murphy found genuinely evil. Tonight, we expose the 9 Golden Age stars who Audie Murphy, America's greatest real-life hero, reportedly unmasked as villains far more dangerous than the ones he faced on screen. Audie Murphy arrived in Hollywood in 1945 as the most decorated American soldier of World War II. Unlike the actors who played war heroes on screen, Murphy had lived through hell, witnessing the deaths of countless friends, killing enemy soldiers at close range, and performing acts of almost unbelievable courage under fire. A veteran who served with Murphy explained, he'd seen men sacrifice themselves for their buddies. He'd also seen cowards who talked tough but ran when the bullets started flying. That experience gave him a sixth sense about phonies. Murphy's own transition to civilian life was far from smooth. He suffered from what we now recognize as severe PTSD, experiencing nightmares, sleeping with a gun under his pillow, and battling addiction to sleeping pills. These struggles gave him insight into human frailty and a deep empathy for those facing genuine challenges. What he could not abide, according to those who knew him, was the hypocrisy of stars who crafted public images completely at odds with their private behavior. Murphy didn't expect people to be perfect. He just expected them to be honest. The stars who made his list weren't there because they had flaws. Everyone has those. They made the list because they were living lies. One of the stars on Murphy's list was Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling hero with Nazi sympathies. To this day, Flynn is remembered for his heroic exploits on screen in classics, such as Captain Blood and the Adventures of Robin Hood, films in which he fought for justice. According to the private assessments of Murphy, however, Flynn's real character was a country mile from these personas. Rumors of Nazi sympathies, relationships with underage girls, and assault allegations dogged Flynn throughout his career. Having spent years in combat against the atrocities perpetuated by the Third Reich, Murphy was particularly exercised by suggestions that Flynn was an admirer of Hitler and fascist ideology in the 1930s, going so far as to have traveled to Europe in a failed attempt to meet Hitler before America entered the war. His personal life was none too savory either. In 1942, Flynn was tried for statutory assault of 2 underage girls. Though acquitted, the trial revealed patterns of predatory behavior. There Murphy reportedly refused to attend veterans' events where Flynn was also appearing, saying, "I didn't fight in Europe to come home and shake hands with their admirers." Murphy believed that true character was revealed in private moments, not public performances. On those terms, Flynn was contemptible. He saw Flynn's heroic persona on screen as a form of stolen valor, appropriating the symbols of heroism without embodying one iota of the qualities. History has subsequently confirmed the darker elements of Flynn's private life, portraying a man whose charm masked predatory behavior, political extremism, and moral bankruptcy. The second star was Frank Sinatra, the much-adored singer with his mob connections. Sinatra was America's most beloved crooner, arguably the smoothest voice, indisputably one of the most talented. Beneath this seeming sophistication, though, Murphy allegedly saw something very different. A man whose associations with organized crime and willingness to use violence and terror to get his way betrayed a character that stood in stark contrast to the entertainer. Murphy, who had served with men of real honor and loyalty, is said to have viewed Sinatra's actions as a corruption of those values. Sinatra's relationships with such figures as Sam Giancana, Lucky Luciano, and Carlo Gambino were an open secret in Hollywood, but rarely reported publicly. Presumably, Sinatra acted as some kind of liaison between the mob and Hollywood, cleaned some of his money through casino investments, and used such ties to further his career and terrorize his competitors. Murphy was also put off by Sinatra's treatment of journalists and critics who spoke unfavorably about him. He allegedly received threats, or damage to property, or physical intimidation. The contrast between Sinatra's public image as a suave entertainer and patriotic American and his private behavior struck Murphy as a noxious form of deception. While audiences heard charming songs about love and loyalty, Murphy is said to have seen a man whose notion of those values had been corrupted by power and ambition. The third star was Spencer Tracy, the beloved actor with a dark side. Tracy projected an image of solid decency in films like Boys Town and Judgment at Nuremberg, and his long relationship with Katharine Hepburn has been romanticized as one of Hollywood's great love stories. Murphy's private observations, however, painted a different picture. Tracy struggled with violent alcoholism and abusive behavior behind the scenes. Murphy, who understood the toll of trauma, had compassion for addiction, but not for how Tracy treated others during his worst episodes. Sets sometimes shut down for days due to his drinking, and studios willingly protected his image at great cost. Murphy was particularly disturbed by Tracy's treatment of crew members, electricians, and camera operators, seeing it as revealing of his true character. Tracy's charm toward directors and executives masked contempt for those without power. Murphy noticed these contradictions and understood the danger of enabling behavior that thrived on deception. Tracy's internal conflict, his Catholic guilt, alcoholism, and complicated relationship with Hepburn, created a man at war with himself. Murphy saw him as a tragic figure, a man with potential for goodness who repeatedly succumbed to his worst impulses. For Murphy, accountability mattered more than fame or box office success. 4. W.C. Fields, the misanthropic comedian, developed a comic persona as a child-hating, alcohol-loving misfit that pleased audiences that assumed it was mostly an act. According to Murphy's private assessments, Fields' on-screen character was less a performance than a slightly exaggerated version of his authentic self, a man whose genuine misanthropy and cruelty were passed off as comedy. A former studio worker who encountered Fields regularly said he was a beloved comedian, but cruel, antisocial, and deeply hateful behind the scenes. Murphy, having seen the worst of humanity in combat, was disturbed by how Fields seemed to genuinely despise people, especially children, rather than just playing a character. Fields' legendary alcoholism wasn't a comic exaggeration. He reportedly drank 2 quarts of liquor daily for decades. Unlike Spencer Tracy, whose drinking fueled episodes of abuse followed by remorse, Fields' consumption seemed only to intensify the caustic personality that existed even when sober. According to a former child actor who worked with him, Fields was known to insult children and staff and spew bigotry in private. Studios presented this as part of his comic persona, but Murphy reportedly found nothing funny about how Fields treated vulnerable people when cameras weren't rolling. What really troubled Murphy was how the entertainment industry repackaged genuine cruelty as harmless comedy. Those close to Murphy said he found it disturbing that audiences were essentially laughing at real hatred branded as entertainment. Some men drink to forget. He drank because he already had, a fellow actor recalled Murphy saying. What struck Murphy as especially revealing was the way Fields treated children. Although his on-screen antipathy toward kids was played for laughs, his off-screen behavior toward young actors was genuinely hurtful. Multiple accounts described Fields deliberately intimidating child performers, making demeaning comments about their appearance or talent, and creating a hostile environment that often left many in tears. Murphy, who maintained a special compassion for children, viewed Fields' behavior as meanness of spirit that couldn't be excused as mere comedy or artistic temperament. 5. The screen queen, Joan Crawford, ruled with terror behind her glorious public persona. She cast herself as Hollywood royalty, a star who overcame humble beginnings to become an icon of power, refinement, and independence. If Murphy's private observations were any indication, Crawford's private life was a far darker story. Insiders knew her well for allegations of child abuse, manipulation, and tyrannical behavior. While the world saw a powerful, independent woman, Murphy saw a woman who used her power to hurt rather than protect. Her abuse of her adopted children, chronicled years later in Christina Crawford's memoir Mommy Dearest, is perhaps the most disturbing part of Crawford's private behavior. Many of Christina's accounts of physical and emotional abuse accounts that included Crawford's fabled rages, extreme punishments, and psychological manipulations were corroborated by several of her contemporaries. Murphy's co-stars reportedly feared even saying her name. For someone like Murphy, who had seen genuine evil in the war, recognizing those patterns in a beloved actress was deeply disturbing. Beyond her children, Crawford was notorious for her behavior towards household staff, studio employees, and anyone she perceived as beneath her. Former maids, assistants, and studio workers described her as obsessed with control, cleanliness, and deference, who would explode in rage over minor infractions and take pleasure in humiliating those who served her. Murphy reportedly said of Crawford that she saved her worst behavior for situations wherein she had absolute power, such as with her children at home or her subordinates on set. This is what made her so particularly troubling: the complete disconnection between her public persona as a strong, sophisticated woman and her private cruelty. Murphy believed power and success carried a responsibility toward others, a principle Crawford seemed to reject utterly. 6. The cultivated cynic George Sanders made a career out of playing sophisticated, cynical villains whose cultured exteriors masked cruel intentions. According to Murphy's assessments, Sanders' screen persona was less a performance than an extension of his authentic self. A man whose contempt for others was real, not merely acted. Sanders was cynical, arrogant, and openly hostile to anyone he felt was his inferior. While many actors play villains and are lovely people, Sanders genuinely shared the elitist disdain common to many of his characters. He held the general public in contempt, as well as the vulgarity of American culture, and more generally, he found human interaction tedious. Murphy reportedly recognized in Sanders a particularly disturbing kind of cruelty: the casual cruelty of a man who considered humanity itself contemptible. Sanders had a reputation for treating those he considered his inferiors, which apparently included crew members, assistants, and service workers, with contempt. Various witnesses recount how Sanders would refuse to learn names and address people with demeaning comments about their appearance or intelligence, making them feel fearful and humiliated. What disturbed Murphy most about Sanders was that the latter cloaked cruelty in a masquerade of intellect. Unlike stars whose bad behavior stemmed from insecurity or addiction, Sanders presented his contempt for others as a rational, even enlightened perspective. His eventual suicide in 1972, leaving a note reading "I'm bored," seemed to confirm Murphy's assessment of a man so disconnected from empathy he found existence itself tedious. For Murphy, who had witnessed extreme suffering and profound courage during the war, Sanders' nihilistic worldview was a particularly empty form of evil, cold indifference, and a complete rejection of human connection. 7. Charles Laughton was one of Hollywood's most celebrated actors, with career-defining performances in such classics as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Witness for the Prosecution, and Mutiny on the Bounty. But behind the artistic genius, Murphy's private observations showed him to be a man capable of a really disturbing capacity for cruelty in his treatment of colleagues, particularly young or vulnerable performers. A former script supervisor says that Charles Laughton was a behind-the-scenes tyrant, emotionally abusive to actors and assistants. Murphy, who knew a thing or two about legitimate authority from his military days, saw, in Laughton, power exercised not to uplift, but to degrade. Though his tyrannical behavior on the set was legendary to insiders, it was carefully shielded from the public. Laughton would deliberately humiliate the less experienced actors by calling out their looks, intelligence, or talent in front of an entire cast and crew. These were not constructive critiques, but acts of establishment of dominance to instill fear. Apparently, Laughton enjoyed pushing someone's deepest insecurities until they broke down and took pleasure in the process. What disturbed Murphy more was how Laughton's undeniable genius was used to justify behavior that would never be tolerated elsewhere. Studios, directors, and fellow actors excused his abuse as the eccentricities of a brilliant artist, leaving victims without recourse. Having served under officers who inspired men through respect rather than fear, Murphy found Laughton's approach to leadership particularly odious. Laughton's contempt for crew members, from camera operators and lighting technicians to production assistants, spoke more volumes about his character than any performance he could have put on screen. Murphy believed true greatness included how one treated those who could do nothing for them, and by that measure, Laughton's genius was deeply compromised. The contrast between his sensitive, humane performances on screen and the reported cruelty toward colleagues created a disconnect that Murphy found deeply troubling. 8. Tallulah Bankhead, the uninhibited narcissist, was known for her throaty voice, flamboyant personality, and outrageous behavior both on and off screen. While the public saw an exciting free spirit, Murphy allegedly recognized a more disturbing pattern, a profound narcissism that destroyed everything in its wake. A former assistant describes her as wild and narcissistic, emotionally abusive to her lovers and co-stars. Bankhead's treatment of household staff and assistants reportedly revealed the darker side of her personality. She would make outrageous demands at all hours, throw tantrums when her wishes weren't fulfilled, and create an atmosphere of fear among those who work for her. In one notorious incident, she referred to her maid as subhuman in front of dinner guests, airily dismissing the woman's humanity. Murphy, who grew up in rural poverty and had deep respect for ordinary people, reportedly found her sense of entitlement and class prejudice particularly offensive. Bankhead's narcissism didn't stop with staff. Accounts from her lovers and co-stars detail manipulative behavior, emotional volatility, and the exploitation of other people's vulnerabilities for her own entertainment. Mostly written off as part of her larger-than-life personality, Murphy reportedly recognized this as the core of her character. For a man who had seen the best and worst of humanity during wartime, Bankhead was the civilian version of evil, the casual dehumanization of others to suit one's convenience or simply to amuse oneself. Murphy had a simple test for character. He watched how people treated those who could do nothing for them. To that measure, Bankhead's behavior showed her as a deeply flawed and exploitative character. The contrast between her public image as a liberated, convention-defying personality and her treatment of vulnerable people created a hypocrisy Murphy found particularly insidious. 9. Gig Young, with his murderous core cloaked in a charming facade, had established his career playing sophisticated, slightly world-weary characters, winning an Academy Award for They Shoot Horses, Don't They? He perpetuated an image as one of Hollywood's most likable leading men. But Murphy's private observations allegedly exposed a dangerous psychological darkness lurking beneath his affable exterior. According to a former co-star, while Young had charm, he struggled with addiction, rage, and ultimately murdered his wife before taking his own life. Young's struggles with alcoholism and barbiturates were well documented within the industry, though carefully kept hidden from view. The substances certainly didn't create his darker tendencies, they merely removed the brakes that held them in check. Murphy allegedly refused to recommend Young for some film roles due to the volatility he saw lurking beneath Young's placid surface. Young's relationships with women reportedly exposed disturbing patterns of jealousy, control, and abuse. His charm and professional success allowed him to maintain the public image of a sophisticated, melancholic leading man, masking a dangerous instability that Murphy recognized early on. Tragically, Murphy's assessment was validated in 1978, when 3 weeks after marrying his fifth wife, Kim Schmidt, Young shot her to death before killing himself in their Manhattan apartment. For Murphy, who had experienced genuine violence on the battlefield, Young represented a disturbing case of internal warfare spilling outward, claiming not only his own life, but that of an innocent victim. Murphy knew darkness and carried his own demons from the war along with him, but he believed in controlling impulses and never causing harm to others. Young's final act proved to be the ultimate failure of such moral responsibility and served as a warning about the dangers of ignoring warning signs in Hollywood's polished and talented performers.